Okay, now that was thought process. Now let's talk about thought content. Thought content refers to the themes that occupy the person's thoughts, basically what they think about. And specifically, we're most interested in abnormal thought and perceptual content like delusions or hallucinations. Examples of these include preoccupations, illusions, hallucinations, ideas of reference, which is often abbreviated in a mental status section of a report as IOR, derealization, depersonalization, delusions. Let me define some of these. So, preoccupations, the person is preoccupied abnormally with something, so we're talking about, again, perseverations, or obsessions of some sort, or compulsions. Suicidal or homicidal ideation would be included in that. The person is preoccupied with thoughts of suicide or thoughts of killing someone. Those are abbreviated as SI and HI. Suicidal ideation, homicidal ideation. Illusions refers to misinterpretations of the environment. So the person there's a tree blowing outside the window, and the person sees instead, or thinks that they see someone moving outside the window. That's misinterpretation, and that's normal. We all experience those kinds of things sometimes. That needs to be distinguished from hallucinations. These are false perceptions of things, false sensory perceptions. And they can be auditory, which is abbreviated as AH, or visual, VH, so auditory hallucination, visual hallucination, or they could be tactile or olfactory. A person smells something that's not there. The tactile hallucinations are sometimes a symptom present in withdrawal from some drugs. Ideas of reference, these are symptoms of paranoia, for example. The person misinterprets events in the outside world as having some kind of direct personal reference to them. So I heard the announcer on the radio talking about my mood this morning. Derealization, we talked about this a little bit last semester, feeling that the outer environment is unreal somehow. And then depersonalization is the sensation that oneself or parts of oneself are unreal in some way. Delusions. Okay, let's talk about delusions. Delusions, a fixed false belief that's firmly held as true despite concrete evidence to the contrary. So beliefs that seem odd to you when you're interviewing someone need to be probed carefully to make sure that there's no validity to them before you call them a delusion. It might be a delusion if someone tells you they're being followed constantly. It would be an example of a paranoid delusion, maybe. But say the person is a man going through a divorce, and his almost or soon-to-be ex-wife has hired a private investigator. So maybe he isn't delusional after all in thinking he's being followed. There's some evidence that his belief may be true. There are different kinds of delusions. So delusions of control, the belief that some sort of outside force is controlling one's actions. Once interviewed a man who was schizophrenic who believed that Hecko was controlling his movements and thoughts. Hawaii Electric Company. Erotomania, we talked about that a little bit last semester, kind of an interesting delusion. The person believes that someone else is in love with them. A grandiose delusion, the person has an inflated self of self-worth. They power, wealth, God has me as his right-hand man. I am ruler of the world. I am the wealthiest person in the United States, etc., etc. And this is the kind of delusion that you might see with mania of some sort. A somatic delusion, the person has some sort of they have firmly believed that they have some kind of a physical defect. It may be a bizarre somatic delusion. They believe that their insides are turning to garbage, for example, or that, well, never mind. You get the idea. Delusions of reference, that things that happen that have nothing to do with them actually apply to them. So, not unlike hearing somebody on the radio talking about you, or thinking that someone on the radio is talking about you when they're talking about the news. And persecutory delusions, again, someone wishes you ill, it wants to hurt you. This is, again, a paranoid kind of a delusion. Even though you're going to be testing cognitive functioning later, at the beginning of the interview you should collect some clinical impressions of different domains of cognitive functioning, so that if you see any what you suspect are some sort of abnormality, you can include it in the hypotheses that you're going to generate, right? And you might include additional testing as well, because the abnormalities. So the major areas of cognition that you pay attention to in the mental status exam are alertness, attention, concentration, and memory. And again, just like the other domains we've talked about, what you're really most interested in is what is clinically outside of normal limits. So if the person with alertness, you would note whether the person looks sleepy, slumped in their chair, looks lethargic, or is particularly alert to everything you're doing and follows all of your movements and writing with a lot of attention, which you might refer to as hypervigilant in your mental status exam write-up. Then with attention, concentration, and memory, again, you want to pay attention to any kinds of problems that seem to be interfering either with the assessment process itself, the individual's life in general. So whether or not you're going to test short-term memory in the assessment, it would be noteworthy if a client doesn't remember important details of their childhood or their schooling. It might be something that has organic kinds of roots, or it might be something that's psychological, but either way it's important information when you're developing your hypotheses. Now, in some kinds of mental status formats, you can actually use simple tests to evaluate things like attention, memory, short-term memory, and so on. And we'll talk about those a little bit when we actually practice doing some mental status observations. And then, of course, memory, you're looking at the immediate memory, short-term, and then long-term memory, perhaps informally in the mental status exam, and more formally when you are actually testing the person. It depends on the kind of testing you're doing, of course. Next, we have insight and judgment. And sometimes this is referred to as prefrontal functioning. Anyone recognize that term? Basically, insight and judgment are kind of higher order skills, and they're associated with functioning of the prefrontal cortex area of the brain. Attention and concentration are also associated with the prefrontal cortex, but some functions have to do as well with kind of, I guess they're like personality variables, things like judgment, planning, insight. Really, executive functioning is the term for it. They're complex domains of functioning and difficult to assess, and particularly with clinical judgment alone, it might be you might come to conclusions about the person's judgment, for example, over the entire course of the interview with them. And even at the beginning, you want to kind of evaluate them broadly. You can evaluate how appropriate you think the person's judgment has been in the past, their ability to anticipate the consequences of their behavior and to make the appropriate decisions, right? So if you have somebody who's been arrested multiple times for selling drugs, they probably don't have the best judgment, either because they're continuing to commit the act or they continue to get caught. You want to look at planning, the person's ability to plan, their ability to anticipate the future when they're acting, to control impulses when it's appropriate. How do they consider the future when they're acting? So planning and impulse control are pretty highly connected, and again, they're both considered to be prefrontal functioning. If you evaluate someone who has some kind of injury to this portion of the brain, these will be areas that you'll be assessing in depth. So you have a client, say, who you're assessing because they say someone who's been referred to you, an adolescent referred to you because of extreme delinquent behavior, say vandalizing property maybe. You'll want to be able to determine whether these kinds of acts were planned and premeditated or were actually just the result of poor impulse control. The person did this on the spur of the moment. Because those kinds of behaviors have really different roots. And treatment for either one of the situations, the planned and premeditated versus the, spur of the moment, would look really different. And then insight refers to how aware the person is, that they have difficulties, that they need help, or that they play some part in their own problems, or just as to what the problems are. So you have somebody who's been, say, mandated to a drug rehabilitation, and the person reports that they understand their drug use served as a way of coping with negative emotions. That would constitute pretty high insight, as opposed to they see their current situation as just something that gets in the way of them being able to enjoy themselves on drugs again. That would be low insight. This is a section of the mental status exam which can be useful if you want to try to determine how a person is functioning developmentally. Because children, for example, you don't expect to have high insight. You don't expect a child to understand the role they play in their own difficulties necessarily. This is a capacity that kind of develops throughout adolescence. So if you have an adult man who has extremely low insight into his problems, you can conceptualize him as functioning, at least in this domain, as a pre-adolescent. Okay, that covers the highlights. We'll be practicing this. Here's an example of an initial mental status exam of a person who's diagnosed with depression and also some psychotic features. And this gives you an idea of the kind of language that would go into a mental status report. And you'll pick this up over time. It's got its own language, as you can see. So, appearance, person is described as disheveled, somnolent, slouched down in their chair, uncooperative. Their behavior is evidences psychomotor retardation, poor eye contact. They talk, their speech is marked by moderate latency, and that means they don't immediately say something. There's a lag time before they start to speak when you ask them a question. Their tone or their volume is soft. The speech is slow. It's got paucity of content, that's the same thing as poverty of content. It means there's not much in the speech. They don't say much. That's important. Mood, remember this is what you ask them. They describe themselves as really down. Affect is blunted. That's partway between restricted and flat. So not relatively expressionless. But their affect is congruent with their mood. So they describe themselves as essentially depressed, and they look as though they're depressed. Thought process is linear. Remember, that follows a logical sequence from beginning to end of thought. It's goal-directed, that is, it goes somewhere when they launch some thought, something that they're going to say. They're making some sort of a point. Again, paucity of content, though. And the thought content, the person is positive for, remember what these are? Suicidal ideation, auditory hallucinations, person hears voices, evidence of paranoia, so some delusional content. VH, remember, visual hallucinations. IOR, that goes with the paranoia, ideas of reference. And, and I'm missing an important detail here. That means there are minuses before those, sorry. So the person has suicidal ideation, auditory hallucinations, paranoia, but there are no visual hallucinations, no ideas of reference, and no homicidal ideation. Cognitively, they're alert, they're focused, and the numbers you see here reflect scores on mini mental status exam, which we'll talk about in class. Remember I said there's some simple kinds of tests that you can give a person to test their cognition, and that's what these are. Insight fair, judgment poor. Now here's another example of a mental status exam extracted from a full psychological report. Sometimes mental status is also referred to as behavioral observations or mental status / behavioral observations. And I don't know where or how that started. I think that very behaviorally oriented psychologists and clinicians don't like dragging too much medical content into the psychological realm. Mental status started out really as a psychiatric term, and so it's part of a medical report. Behavioral observations is more psychological in origin. Really, they're the same thing. So you can call this section either one. It's really pretty much the same thing. And I'll let you read this, but this is an example of a write-up of the kind of shorthand that I showed you in the last two slides. Not the same person though, not the same evaluation. And you can see if you read this that a mental status section of a report or a mental status report doesn't have to be dry. It can have quite a lot of content in it, as this one does. Alright, we will stop here and start practicing this stuff very soon.